Welcome, everyone. My name is Margot Day, and I'm honored to moderate this panel. We have three panelists today with expertise on peace negotiations between Ethiopia and Eritrea, the United States and the Taliban, and the parties to the Yemen peace process. We really welcome audience participation. We would love to receive many questions from you throughout this, so please do submit questions. I'll be monitoring them. My plan is to ask a few questions of my own to the panelists for about the first 40 minutes, and then turn to audience questions in the final 20. But if I see some questions coming in that are right on point to what we're discussing, I'm very happy to weave them in as we go. There really is so much to cover, since we could have an hour-long discussion on any one of these peace processes alone. So I am just going to quickly thank Matt Hoisington and Ruchi Gill for putting this panel together, and to ASIL for ensuring that there's time devoted to this important topic. And with that, let's begin. So to our three panelists, could I please ask you to introduce yourself and to provide the audience with a little context about the particular peace negotiations process that you'll be discussing and what your involvement has been. Why don't we begin, please, with Laurel Miller, and then we can turn to Professor Ephraim Isak and conclude with Ibrahim Jalal. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Margot, and thanks for having me here today. I'm currently the director of the Asia program at the International Crisis Group. I have, before this position, I spent some time at the RAND Corporation, where I did some research projects related to Afghanistan, including a report that was published at the end of last year, which laid out what a comprehensive peace agreement for Afghanistan could conceivably look like, and had some associated analysis related to that. I also, from 2013 to the middle of 2017, I was at the US State Department as the deputy and then acting special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, during which I was involved as a practitioner in the efforts to try to launch an Afghan peace process. So just a quick word of background. It's been a full decade since, even a little bit more than that, since the US began efforts, initially mostly quiet, but then increasingly public, to try to catalyze an Afghan peace process. Those efforts proceeded in fits and starts with a lot of ups and downs, and over most of that course of time, not with any degree of evident success. The US in late 2018, this is after I left the State Department, intensified for the first time its efforts to try to achieve a negotiated political settlement of the war in Afghanistan. And for the first time, really put that at the center of US policy. Those efforts, over more than a year of negotiations, culminated in what I would call a kind of first stage agreement, which was an agreement signed on February 29th in Doha, Qatar, between the United States and the Taliban, not including the Afghan government or other Afghan groups. That is an agreement that isn't what I would call a peace agreement. It's an agreement that helps set the stage and the possible conditions for a peace process among Afghans, and hopefully eventually a peace agreement among Afghans. And that US-Taliban deal includes provisions related to the drawdown and ultimately withdrawal of American and NATO forces from Afghanistan. It includes some, in exchange for that, commitments on the part of the Taliban to prevent Afghanistan from, again, being used as a launching pad for external terrorist acts against the United States or its allies. It also includes, importantly, a commitment on the part of the Taliban to engage in peace talks with the Afghan government and other Afghan political factions. Those are the There are a few other pieces of the deal, but it's really quite brief. It's only a few pages long, and those are the main elements of it. A US commitment to withdraw in exchange for a Taliban commitment on the US counterterrorism priorities, but really, most importantly, in my view, an opening for a possible peace process in a next stage among Afghans. And and without that next stage, the US Taliban deal isn't in and of itself terribly meaningful, because the US will do what the US will do in terms of withdrawal, no matter what it said to the Taliban. But if there is a peace process, then that changes the context for American policy and for other options as well. That next stage, the negotiations among Afghans, was supposed to commence on March 10th, and it hasn't yet. If people are interested, we can talk a little bit about that. But the key point is that there are still efforts, or still diplomacy aimed at inching forward toward the launch of an Afghan peace process, but it hasn't happened yet. I think there's a reasonably good prospect that it will happen, the launching of talks sometime in the next couple of months. But we'll have to see. And then I think in the discussion, we'll get into what some of the issues might be for that next stage if it does in fact materialize.
Thank you. Professor Isak?
Yes, my name is Ephraim Isaac. I'm chairman of the board of the Peace and Development Center in Ethiopia. We have traditional elders who are members of this organization, but we are supported by numerous international organizations, the Swedish government, the Norwegian, the European Union, USA, Germany, Denmark, and so on and so forth. And today we have a big staff of about 40 people who travel all over Ethiopia, dialoguing with community leaders and tribal elders or national elders to try to resolve conflicts that exist among them. The Peace and Development Center started as an ad hoc peace committee 30 years ago, after the 30-year war between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and inter-ethnic conflicts within the whole country, tremendously devastating, that the US Secretary of State described as comparable to the First World War. And the Committee of Ethiopian Elders negotiated the settlement of this 30-year war, and we participated in the formation of the new transitional government, and we supported that organization financially through grants we've received from the international community. Thereafter, as some problems arose between the government and some of the other political parties, people were sent into jail. Our organization focused specifically in negotiating the settlement between government and prisoners and the release of political prisoners. In 1998, a war broke out between Ethiopia and Eritrea. And that was a very, very tragic war. And the Elders Committee of Ethiopia was the only Ethiopian Eritrean group, where a group of Ethiopians and Eritreans accepted by both parties outside the international community. And we shuttled several times during 1998, 2000 to discuss directly with the Prime Minister of Ethiopia and with the President of Eritrea, both of whom received us with great love and respect. And throughout the last 30 years also, we had continued to try to dialogue to improve the relationship between those two countries. On the side, I should add, I am also I've been involved with Middle East peace. I've been a member of the American Professors for Peace in the Middle East. I have been very much interested in the Arab-Jewish relations issue. My father was born in Yemen. He was an Arab Jew, so to say, and my mother is Ethiopian. So I have been very much involved in that. And Interestingly, I have been a member of the National Committee on the American Foreign Policy, which actually spearheaded the peace negotiation in Northern Ireland. And I happen to be a member of about 50 people that invited me when Bill Flynn and Thomas Moran, who actually spearheaded, they've not gotten enough credit. They're really the ones who need the credit as the Irish, both of them of Irish origin, and they were very much interested. They'd invite David Trimble and Jerry Adams, with whom I've had many lunches during those days. So on the side, I have been very fortunate and very fortunate to have been involved in dialogue with those Northern Ireland leaders. And more recently, I had been approached by a group of tribal elders in Yemen who would like to get support, particularly from the American Yemenite Jewish Federation of America. They made it very clear that the tribal elders respect all religions, and any support they can get from any group they will welcome. And therefore, I have started some kind of a dialogue. My brother there, Ibrahim, will later speak about this. We have had one dialogue at the National Committee for American Foreign Policy, and we're planning some other dialogue on that issue. I guess maybe in conclusion, I should simply say my work has been associated with some international organizations like the Tannenbaum Center for Interfaith Understanding, the Fellowship in Prayer, the Temple of Understanding. Some of those organizations have given me some little grant, and I've also been honored as a knight by the King of Sweden for the work I have done in Ethiopia. And the American Psychological Association has also given me the Morton Roach Prize for Conflict Resolution. I don't want to get into listing all the honors I have received for the little work, but the reason why I am very maybe low-key is because the traditional Ethiopian elders don't believe in much publicity. In fact, that is the major problem we have had in the past. There are people who've done little things, just walking around, but have big noise and big trumpets they're blowing through the media, through the television. And in our constitution of the Ethiopian Peace and Development Center, it says we don't talk to the media. Now, even talking to you, I'm going to be very careful because some of my colleagues, and so we've been very much involved really with a lot of, we are the group of elders. As you remember, in 2005, there was an election in Ethiopia, which was contested by the opposition. There was a demonstration of 1 million people in which 200 people were killed. And then 25 leaders of all the opposition political parties were sent to jail. It is our group, the Ethiopian Peace Elders, that negotiated. I personally had direct contact with the Prime Minister continually. And we resolved that issue when we got all those political leaders out of jail through the traditional elders system. We continue even now in trying to dialogue quietly. Again, as I said, people may not know, we've not been publicizing, writing, publishing, trumpeting what we do, but we are very deeply involved even now also in what's going on in the area in Ethiopia and Eritrea. And I'll close by simply saying, however, I do this as a traditional elder, not as a professional person in the field of conflict resolution, but as a traditionally concerned individual following the traditional method. By profession, I'm a professor. I'm a founder of the Harvard African and African American Studies Department, which has a prize named after me now. And I was last week honored by the Harvard Divinity School as one of the distinguished alumni of the Harvard Divinity School. And so my actual personally profession is academic, but on the side, I am very, very much a believer in world peace, and I'll continue to work hard. We'll talk later if there's any question, but I think that's enough, isn't it? That's enough, isn't it? Or do you
That's
want
perfect. No, that's great. Why don't we turn to Ibrahim for an introduction, and then I'll turn back with a few specific questions for each of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with senior experts here today. So I'm Ibrahim Jalal, an non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute's Gulf and Yemen program. I would keep it that short. So I'll talk briefly, I'll give an overview of conflict and peace trajectories in Yemen. Yemen is bordered by Saudi Arabia and Oman. So we've had, two conflict actors. It's an armed conflict between the government of Yemen and the Houthi insurgency backed by Iran. In September 2014, the Houthis stormed the capital, overthrew the government, and then house arrested both the president and the cabinet. A few months later, Saudi Arabia, at the request of the president, formed a military coalition, and since then, the conflict took a complete juncture. The UN engagement started in 2011 with the advent of the Arab Spring. So we've had 3 envoys since then. Between 2015 and 2016, we've had multiple rounds of peace talks in Switzerland and Kuwait. The first few rounds focused on competence building measures. The ones in Kuwait discussed substantive issues such as the formation of a unity government, security and military arrangements, the formation of an interim leadership where we have a consensual vice president that would lead the transitional processes. But the main hurdle over these discussions lied in the sequence. So from a Houthi perspective, they prioritized the political over security and military measures. And when they stormed the capital, Sana'a, in September 2014, they imposed an agreement called Peace and National Partnership Deal, which formed a new cabinet, and then they continued the scale of the armed rebellion to where the country is today. The government wants otherwise began with security and military arrangements and then depart to the political arrangements. So any cabinet does not become a victim of armed groups. But in 2018, February, we had Martin Griffiths, the 3rd United Nations Special Envoy, British national backed by Whitehall in London, and he received tremendous support by the United Nations Security Council, coalition of INGOs, and so forth. So his first mission departed from nationwide comprehensive peace agreements to what some call piecemeal, or what I call fragmentary peace approaches that throws the quest for a nationwide peace agreement to focus on cities. So the focus was about Hodeidah. The coalition-backed joint forces had a military advantage on the ground then. They were, in fact, a few kilometers away from the port city of Hodeidah. The international pressure culminated, so that halted, and we've had the Stockholm Agreement. The Stockholm Agreement generally was signed in December 2018 after the Houthis abandoned Geneva talks in September, 3 months ahead. And it has 3 subsidiary deals. The Hodeidah Agreement, and that's the most important component, and 2 others are symbolic to an extent. There is understanding, a vague half-page document, and then prisoner swap. And that's a continuation of previous talks. So I'll just focus briefly on Hodeidah deal, and that will be the pillar of our discussion today here. The deal generally is shorter than 2 pages, and it's vague, very vague. It used that vagueness, to have open, loose interpretations that became problematic. So 1.5 years on, nothing in terms of tangible progress has been formed generally. So the 4 points I want to make of this discussion generally, now we have lost the track from discussing a comprehensive nationwide peace agreement. And that led to an intensification in other front lines other than Hodeidah, in Bayda, in Aden, and in many other places that I'll discuss later in detail. And it justified as well armed rebellion of other groups. In the south, we've had the UAE-backed Southern Transitional Council, which was the government of Aden. So the overall landscape of the conflict became messy. We've had more actors on the ground now, and unhappily, we did not have a significant change in the relationship between the government and other actors engaged in the process. So that's my take for now. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I mean, so as we've heard, these three processes are at really different stages, and and even the documents that have existed so far have varied so much. So thank you for that rich background from the three of you. I'm wondering if I can ask a question, and hopefully with like kind of a short answer from each of you, maybe under 3 minutes from each. I'm curious what the prospects are that you see for durable peace in your view, taking into account all those differences we just covered. I'd be very interested to hear what you think the prospects are. So kind of some short answers on this one. If we could maybe start with Professor Isaac and then turn to Yemen and then Afghanistan, that would be great.
Well, maybe I should preface an answer to your question by saying, to make it very clear, that what we're doing is traditional peacemaking and not formal United Nations, or we are like second track, what they call second track. And that involves the belief that conflicts do not necessarily arise, as most people believe, from economic problem. Yes, economic and social problems contribute to conflicts, but however, we believe very strongly that the conflicts arise not only out of some major challenges, uh, lawlessness, malevolence, material deprivation, those contribute. But however, often the deep root of conflict is in the human heart. And government professionals, in fact, UN international experts have always argued on that side of the problem of the economic deprivation. Long-lasting peace cannot be achieved just by saying we have solved the formally through political economic resolution. Yes, they help, no question. But long-lasting, I think, well, I think it's some general once said conflict boil down to money. I don't believe that. In fact, if you look at some of the leaders of conflicts in the World Trade Center in Sri Lanka a couple of years ago, in Ethiopia, some of the rich people are in fact, the ones who are generating. Therefore, long-lasting peace, in my judgment, really depends on an understanding of the psychological issues, the human deep, the feeling of deprivation by people, the issue of enmity, which I guess Freud will agree with me about, is deeply rooted in the human instinct. And wars, in my judgment, conflicts are rarely started really by poor or marginalized people. I don't know if there are such things, you tell me. I think Judy Shelton in the New York Times once, in fact, pointed that out, that linking poverty to conflicts is not going to solve the problem. And she pointed out that terrorism, in fact, was terrorism was in fact based on other issues. And I myself believe that if we speak about long-lasting conflicts, we have to start looking at the psychological dimension of conflicts. In other words, inter-people understanding. Right now, we are in fact, in my organization, again, I can't go into detail because again, this kind of peacemaking is very confidential. We want to reach people through elders, through tribal leaders, people who understand what's going on in the community, and the community understands. Between Ethiopia and Eritrea, I am quite sure there will be a long-lasting resolution. I can tell you that Ethiopians and Eritreans are exactly 100% of the same culture and blood. And so why are they fighting? In fact, I don't want to get into the details, but the leaders of the fight between Ethiopia and Eritrea are not, let's say, well, I'm trying to hesitate to say it, people from other parts of Ethiopia, but they are relatives. It's the relatives who are really fighting in the case of Ethiopia and Eritrea. So how do we deal with that? And that is why we're trying to focus on not on the modern international conflict resolution professional philosophy, but on trying to understand what these people have in common religion, language, history. That is what is really very crucial. And of course, dealing with issues economically and politically are really very simple in my judgment. They're very simple. We can calculate 2 plus 2 is 4. But dealing with when two husband and a husband and a wife fight, the issue is not just money or whatever. There may be deeper issues. When brother and brother, I know people in New York City who are two brothers who are trying to kill each other. I know people like that. So this is why long-lasting resolution between Ethiopia and Eritrea is going to depend much, much more on bringing people together to learn how to respect each other, to simplistically to love each other. I'm sorry to say that you're talking politics, I'm talking love. People to respect each other, to love each other, to listen each other, to support each other. I can say much more because I can give you many examples. Maybe later I can mention some of those. But all I'm saying is there will be long-lasting resolution. The problem between Ethiopia and Eritrea, I can assure you, is one of the simplest things if we look at it from that issue of emotional side. Forget the economic and the political side. And we are working on that. And the people themselves are working in that. They are family. They are family. It's a family feud. And so how do you deal with that? Long-lasting resolution is a family resolution.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you on that. Forgive me for interrupting you there. That's a beautiful, fundamental premise, I think, for us to build our discussion off of. So, yeah, thank you so much for that remarks. Ibrahim?
Thank you. I indeed agree with Professor Isaac generally. But to focus on the Yemeni context and the different stages it had when the warring parties went back to Switzerland generally, the first round was informal talks. The parties were not ready to talk to each other. The resentment that war comes up and develops within the minds and hearts of warring parties prevented that. So the second round, there were a little bit of more opening up, and then it developed from there. It has been mainly track one. There's, when you have conflict, you need the agreement of conflict parties, of course. So I'm skeptic about the effect of track 1.5 and 2 engagements within the wider landscape. But surely, if they don't, have a significant level of pressure and influence in a multi-track engagement, I think the conflict continues, especially if the conflict actors do not have any interest within, the context of war economy, and when you have warlords and how that sustains. And I think we've seen, horrific examples in Yemen at all sides of the conflict. But if I answer the second part of the question, which is about the prospects of peace, let me first of all, point some sense, and I'll leave you to figure out the answer. Following the Stockholm Agreement, or the freezing the battle for Hodeidah, which would have, and I assertively believe, changed the course of war in Yemen and the balance of power and so forth, we've seen main trends. One of them is that the United Nations mediator adopted a crisis management approach rather than conflict resolutions. You know how a fireman acts? A fireman always reacts to extinguish fire. Pretty much, that was the situation, or the first task of Martin Griffiths in Hodeidah. And then he got stuck to iron out the strategic ambiguity that the UN implanted in that vague agreement. And we've not seen any progress. The Houthis felt emboldened. A few months after Stockholm, they captured Hajur, and then within the first quarter of 2020, they advanced from Nehm, and that has been a stagnant front line since 2016. So that it falls now, it means something. There's, of course, many problems at the coalition front, and these have reflected on how the war looks today. And then you've had a few, like last week, I think, they captured Radman in Al-Bayda, and that was an emerging hub for tribal resistance outside the formal front line. And then to the south, we've had the STC, the force, the government of Aden, which means the government that was ousted from Sana'a, which is the capital, was ousted again from the interim capital. And that's, again, from a legitimacy perspective, it undermines the legitimacy, of course. Legitimacy is just an international concept. It has, delivery of services. It has how populations perceive that entity. And that leverage of the Houthis, which, turned out to be an emboldenment due to the territorial gains on the ground or due to international policy of appeasement, to the point that when the Houthis shot and killed a ceasefire monitor of the government delegation and the UN-led mission, the United Nations Special Envoy Office failed to point who's the perpetrator. We've been to that level of appeasement, pointing fingers, and I don't understand the logic of that, in effectiveness aspect. And that has reflected on the floating oil tanker of Safir in the West Coast. Overall, we've had a vague agreement, a shrinking authority of the government in favor of emerging and existing armed groups. Some peace agreements might be a transition to the next stage of the conflict. That's what we've seen in both the Stockholm and the Riyadh agreements. Enough. Thank you.
Thank you.
Over to me? Yeah.
Yes, please.
So I think there's really a lot that is of fundamental importance in what Professor Isaac said, and his comments resonate beyond the specifics of Ethiopia and Eritrea, certainly to what I have seen in South Asia, but also to what I've seen in other peace processes and conflict situations around the world, including I was for a number of years involved in the peace processes in the Balkans and the aftermath of that. There's a fundamental difference between political peacemaking, political settlements, and something that you might call social reconciliation, which is broader and deeper. And I think an important lesson from this for practitioners and academics who may be among our audience is, policy and law can only do so much. What they can do, and what formal political peace processes can do, is help to create an opening for broader social reconciliation if they are successful. And certainly I would say that's the case in Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan has not been going on since 2001. It's been going on for 40 years in different phases with different constellations of actors. Before there was a Taliban as such, and before the United States sent 100,000 troops to the country. And so you have to look at that and say the prospects for durable peace are low. I mean, if history is a guide, and 40 years of conflict with shifting constellations of actors and a variety of kinds of grievances is not going to be ended through formal political peacemaking. What that could do, if it's successful, is bring down the levels of violence, bring an end to at least certain dimensions of the conflict, and create some opening for the kind of dialogue and social reconciliation and longer term efforts that are really not going to happen in a context where there is active war going on. Even within the formal peacemaking, in the context of Afghanistan, you have a lot of complexity related to the structure of the process itself, the number of parties and actors who consider themselves stakeholders in the process, the fact that there is a stalemate effectively on the battlefield, and therefore some on both sides still would prefer to continue to fight rather than sit down and make peace, because there's a struggle for power. And then you come to the question of the political issues, even aside from the social issues, of varying conceptions of what the state of Afghanistan should be, and whether you're going to be able to resolve that in a peace negotiation. These are all complexities that are reasons to not be optimistic about the success for even the limited formal peacemaking to work, much less get to durable peace in the country. That said, to end on a not, completely gloomy note, I don't think any peacemaking effort looks, certainly not for any significant conflict, looks inevitable or likely to succeed until it does. It's failure every day until you have some measure of success. And so there's reason to, as practitioners, to persist, and as academics to not be overly determinative in your analysis of what the past means for the future.
Thank you so much. I see a few audience questions coming in that I think really tie into that kind of, does the past project the future, and what we can kind of learn across these different negotiations. So I'm going to ask three and then leave it to you to decide kind of who wants to answer which one, or which one strikes you. So one audience question is, what do each of these cases show us about how the US role can be helpful or detract from progress towards peace? So a question about the US's role. There's a question here specifically related to Eritrea and Ethiopia. So it says, the July 2018 Joint Declaration provided that the 2002 decision of the Boundary Commission would be implemented. What is the current status of that? And then also a question about whether or not we're even seeing like a comparative practice of peace agreements emerge. Like, does that exist? Did the peace processes that you've been involved with like look at other peace processes, or did they act separately? And how much learning is there, if any, across these? So those are the three. Whoever would like to kind of start with one of those, please feel free. Yeah, please, over to you.
I'm happy to jump in with a couple of those and then turn it over. First of all, on the US role, it's a really good question. I think it depends, at least looking at recent peace processes, and people may come up with counterexamples. I think there might be a general rule that the more that US direct interests are at stake, the more unhelpful the US role. I'd be interested if anyone in the audience can come up. I came up with that rule of thumb just now on the fly. But the reason why I say that is, it's one thing for the US to play a kind of mediating or facilitating role when it's someone else's conflict somewhere else. Northern Ireland, you could be a kind of good, honest broker in Northern Ireland. The Balkans, even, that was about, peace and stability in Europe, but not really about the US-European relationship, but not really about US core interests. In Afghanistan, the US is a party to the conflict. It is not a neutral broker. And all of its decisions and calculations are complicated by the fact that the US is a participant on the one hand, pursuing its own interests and looking at all the issues through the lens of its own interests, and on the other, kind of pseudo trying to position itself as an honest broker and facilitator of a peace process. And that is a very uncomfortable juxtaposition. In some cases in the Middle East, I think at times the US has been more of an honest broker, and then at other times has conceived of its interests in different ways, and maybe more politicized ways, that then make its role problematic because of that. So anyway, that's my new, Miller's rule of peace negotiations. I'd be interested for counterexamples. On comparative practice, there is a comparative practice. Certainly in academia, people look at it that way. And there is learning to be done across different peace agreements. I certainly, as someone who was involved from the mid-90s in some peace processes, and I was a lawyer at one point earlier in my career, I, in my later work, have brought that, my own understanding and experience, to bear in later peace processes. What there isn't is any kind of cookie cutter approach. And even some of the academic, more, sort of quantitative statistical analysis approach of like, well, you must have a peacekeeping enforcement mission because in, X percentage of cases, it succeeded when you had that and failed. Like that, interesting, generally not really relevant to actual practice. In the piece of work that I described that I did and published with the RAND Corporation looking at an Afghan peace agreement, we did use comparative research as one of the inputs to the peace agreement that we wrote. And the way in which we used it was to look at the other experiences for ideas and inspiration. So you're not completely recreating the wheel. How have other peace agreements dealt with power sharing? How have they dealt with a military withdrawal process? And you can get ideas and you can get inspiration from those to try to systematically analogize one peacemaking context to another, and therefore say, you know, Colombia is the model for this, or you know, Bosnia is the model for that, I reject as being apposite.
Ibrahim or Professor Isaac, any comments on either of these three questions?
Yes, the question about U.S. role, I'll answer in a very simplistic fashion. I think the U.S. can make a major impact if it looks into traditional peacemaking. Of course, the world has begun to recognize Mandela and the former U.S. Undersecretary Kofi Annan had formed, in fact, an international elders group. The USAID has supported our work, but I think the U.S. can go a long way if it abandons the view that it can rule the world and economically control everybody, and look into this human side of the issues and focus on supporting local people. By local people, I mean the local elders, especially women, by the way. The one thing I really would like to emphasize is mothers have yet not played very much role in international peacemaking, but they can become very important. So if the US gives more support, it can go a long way and okay. Regarding the Ethiopian-Eritrean situation, of course, the irony is I'm so deeply involved with that I cannot say everything. But from the from beginning of the 30-year war, when we had personally spoken to the two leaders directly, I am very familiar with what is going on there. And during the war, as I said personally, I have been involved in dialoguing directly with the two presidents and prime minister. And I still believe that the resolution is in the hands of the people. But the specific question that was asked about the Badime, the use agreement, yes, we do need, of course. You see, I don't mean to be so simplistic that issues of economy, issues of boundary are not important. They're important, but they're less important. In fact, when in 2008, Prime Minister of Ethiopia invited the President of Eritrea, for years, the two countries were disputing over two questions. We do need to dialogue. Let's talk to each other. They both agreed, the two leaders. B, we should resolve the issue of the border conflict. Okay, then what happened is one leader said, we talk first. The other leader said, we remove the border issue first. And that became, I'm not going to say who and mention names of people, and that got stuck. And it got stuck. However, when the new prime minister came in, I say, you know, I consider a friend. And in fact, I remember in my first meeting with him, he's suggesting that I give a call to Eritrea. And I myself did do so. And the interesting thing is, once the two sides said, let's get together, and they hugged each other and shook hands. I guess today, because of Corona, I would have recommended that they just hug, not shake hands, which goes back to ancient Greek way of making peace. Nobody's talking about Badime right now. But you see, the Badime issue, the border conflict issue, was the sour point between the two leaders for several years. But now, of course, I'm not saying that needs still to be resolved. It will be resolved. But isn't it amazing, however, that once the two leaders shook hands and hugged each other, really the issue of border, then they've not been talking too much about that, which was the sticking point, the sore point between the two nations. So we still need, however, you see, I haste to add, of course, all these practical, political, economic issues have to be written in black and white and signed and agreed upon. But the fundamental thing, however, is for the two people to hug each other as they did, and they hugged each other. Nobody's talking. It's a little more complex to talk about this border issue now because I don't want to get into the politics. I mean, there's some things I could say, but isn't it amazing? For me, it is really amazing. For 10 years, when my elders group were trying to get the two leaders together, one said, first get out of accept the UN or the World Court decision about the borders. The other said, okay, we accept it, but let's first talk. And they were arguing for over a decade. And then once, however, there was a human, eye to eye vision of seeing of each other by the two leaders because of the political change on one side, then all of a sudden, I have great respect for President Isaias, whom I know. I have met him many times. I think he means well, and he loves Ethiopia. I can tell you, he loves Ethiopia, and he has family in Ethiopia. And see, Ethiopians and Eritreans are the people of the same blood. 99.999, they are people of the same blood, same language, and so on. And so the issue of the border conflict will be resolved, I'm quite sure. But we still need to work more on that family feud because I don't want to say what family I'm talking about, but once we really completely settle that issue of the personality feelings between groups of people on the two sides, Ethiopia and Eritrea are people who worked together for centuries. They were even one nation at one time. And if you look at their history, people quite often compare Ethiopia and Eritrea with other countries like England and Ireland. And no, they are much more the same language, same religion, mostly both of them, same religion, and the people are even intermarried. The people are family, and that's why I love them. I love, these people are really. It's just this deep psychological question that we have to resolve. Once that happens, there is a big, bright future for the two peoples. So I continue to pray. Border. Yes, we have to deal with the border, but it's more the border inside your heart, inside your stomach that we need to deal with, not on the ground. We can do both.
Thank you. And Ibrahim, any thoughts on the role of the U.S. or that comparative peace agreement point? And then I'll ask a couple more audience questions before we conclude our time.
Great, I'll be brief. The United States has been engaged in Yemen politically and in terms of intelligence sharing to the coalition. 4 years ago, around this time, ahead of American elections, the former U.S. State Secretary John Kerry rebranded the Kuwait Initiative, which technically had an overall framework for political settlement. Unsure how important it is on the agenda ahead of or close to the US elections, which is a couple months ahead. And I think under the Obama administration, there have been a greater degree of activism. With the new administration assuming office, we've seen greater British role, especially that the United Nations Special Envoy is of British nationality. And I think the United States can at least exercise high level of pressure on parties to break the political deadlock that we are in now as COVID-19, continues to spread in Yemen undetected. And by some estimates of the UN, it might infect as many as 16 million people within the next few times generally. In terms of a comparative practice, there are some, comparisons here and there, as Laurel detailed, when people think of, the provisions, whether in terms of how to restructure the military, how to dissolve and integrate command and control structures. In the case of Libya, for example, in January 2020, they had 5+5 joint military committee, which has to discuss how to police Tripoli. And that was, for example, a practice employed in Hodeidah. But whether it really worked out, I would be a little bit, maybe more than needed, skeptic of that. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll turn to a few more audience questions here, knowing that we've got about 10 minutes left to the hour, so maybe we can answer some of these, but not everything. So one question is about inclusivity in the peace process. How does international law ensure that those people who are most affected by the conflict have a voice in resolving that conflict? And we have a career-related question as well, which is, what would be your career advice for how to best prepare to be in a position to negotiate peace agreements or to be engaged in peace negotiations generally? And then also one other question, just, we've talked about policy and law a little bit. And so I'm curious, given that there's a lot of lawyers and law students in the audience, to what extent, if at all, international legal principles influence peace negotiations? How much does the law matter in this case? And so those are the three. So one on how much law matters, one on career advice, and then one on inclusivity in the peace process. Happy to turn it over to answer one or all of those, however you'd like to do it.
I could touch briefly on each one. First of all, on inclusivity, I don't think international law speaks to that at all. There's a range of views on the importance of inclusivity for a peace process, both for being able to conclude, actually reach some kind of agreement, and then also for its durability afterwards. I think this is very context specific. At a minimum, you need to have people at the table. If you're talking about a peace agreement that is aimed at getting people to lay down arms, then the people who control the arms have to be at the table. And sometimes they're external backers, if there are such. If not exactly at the table, somehow in the structure of a peace process. There are also a lot of questions I don't think we have time to get into about inclusion of civil society and women and minority groups too. And I think, in my view, I would just say, some of that goes more to the longer term, deeper kind of peacemaking, peace building that we were talking about earlier than really precisely the question of how do you come up with a document that sets the stage for some of that longer peace building. In terms of the best preparation for being involved in peace negotiations, get lucky. I mean, if you by which you mean like someone who actually is going to be a negotiator of a peace agreement. I mean, yeah, so there's some people who've spent long portions of their career being involved at an expert level in advising peace negotiations and understanding the process and the substance, yes, and sometimes those people are called upon to advise negotiators. But if you look at the people who have actually been negotiators, like they didn't get there by being experts on peace negotiation generally. They're just in positions of authority. And I would say that having a combination of practical experience and having developed your intellectual capital of understanding peace processes and conflict resolution is certainly useful. And you can write about it and think about it and contribute in those ways. But like actually being in the seat is a certain amount of, a large amount of fortuity. In terms of international legal principles, I think it really varies. I mean, I don't want to, when there have been peace processes that dealt with, for instance, border, territorial issues. That's an example of where international legal principles can come into play. In the Afghanistan context, there is the question of fundamental rights and human rights and how they will or will not be preserved in the context of a peace agreement is certainly prominent in the discussion of the peace process, but it's very difficult to say that there are settled international principles that are going to drive that one way or another. Partly because the fact is, you can often just write your way around these things. You know, I mean, coming up with a form of words that kind of checks the box on international legal principles isn't always that hard to do, and is not quite the same as actually getting to the substance, not to be too cynical.
Thank you. We've got 5 minutes left, so I'm wondering if maybe, Ibrahim, could you pick one of the questions to respond to, and then provide Professor Isaac one response as well, and then unfortunately I'm going to have to bring it to a close soon. Thanks.
All right. Thank you. I'll tackle the one of inclusivity. Like Laurel said, international law does not really focus on that. But you have some international mechanisms on the inclusion of youth and women agenda, for example, women, peace and security. And these, at the end of the day, remain, at the discretion of conflict actors. Like in the Yemeni context, in Stockholm, women representation was as many as one, which is disappointing, really disappointing. The Houthi rebels had no representative at all, and they wanted to include then the Southern Transitional Council, which was formed in 2017, thanks to the UAE, generally speaking. And then they were like the peace references, from the point of view of United Nations security resolutions, do not allow us to bring them in. So they needed something like a legal viewpoint to settle that. And then the Riyadh Agreement came in, and the UN Special Envoy Office were like, oh, thanks God, now we can include them in the process because they signed an agreement with the government. So the question of inclusivity really is problematic. And sometimes it surrenders to rebel armed groups at the expense of, peaceful actors who have literally legitimate grievances much more than anybody else and might support durable peace processes. Thank you.
Thank you. And Professor Isaac, the last couple of minutes are to you.
Okay, and I'll speak to the issue of the international legal principles. Being Jewish, I believe that the law is very central. Moses, the father of Judaism, in fact, was the one who gave out the 10 Commandments. And what I'd like to say is that international legal principles are double-edged. We need it. But for instance, in the case of Ethiopia and Eritrea, the decision by the World Court complicated the situation. It complicated the situation because there was no understanding of the original historical inter-ethnic relationship between Ethiopian and Eritreans. They were only following the text of the law, the word. So international legal principle is going to be important, no question about it. We need it. But they have to learn again from others who are looking at these issues above and beyond legal resolution. What happened in the case of Badime and the Eritrean-Ethiopian solution is they were looking at some 19th century, Italian, Ethiopian agreements and so on, without really involving the local people, the national people, without really studying the case. So yes, we need international legal principle, but study. Don't jump into making verdicts, my dear friends of the World Court, International Court, whatever. And so I simply would like to say, include in your decision issues of truth and justice and love. And now we shake hands. As I said, because of the corona, we can't, but we can hug each other. The people of the International Court should start learning hugging each other too.
A perfect note to end on. We do have to draw the discussion to a close. I'll say I've learned so much, and I really wish we had more time because I know there's more questions from the audience, more questions from me. This has been wonderful. So I just wanted to take time to thank you for all of your expertise and time, and also thank the audience and for ASIL for pulling all this together. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shalom, salam, pax tecum.
Thanks, everyone.